What if the app your husband installed to prove he was faithful was the exact same app he used to cover up the worst thing imaginable? Right now, I want you to picture a website. Clean design, soft blue tones, a tagline that sounds almost comforting. The kind of website that makes you feel like someone, somewhere, has finally figured out how to make people good. That website is called Covenant Eyes. And what it does is that it takes a screenshot of your screen every 60 seconds. Every search, every message, every tab. Every single thing you look at online gets captured, graded by an AI, and sent directly to someone you trust. A spouse, a pastor, a mentor. Over 1.7 million people have willingly installed this software on their devices. Not because they were forced to, because they wanted to. Because within their communities, handing over your digital life to be monitored was not seen as surveillance. It was seen as love. One of those 1.7 million people was a sitting United States congressman who installed it on his own teenage son's device. And another one of those people was a man who would go on to become one of the most infamous figures in American television history. A man whose entire public identity was built on the idea that he had nothing to hide. And here is the part that nobody talks about. That man still got caught doing the unthinkable. So if you have ever wondered whether systems like this actually work, or whether they are just a very expensive way of performing goodness without actually having any, stay with me. Because what I am about to walk you through is not just a story about one man's spectacular fall from grace. It is a story about what happens when the architecture of accountability is designed to protect an image instead of discovering a truth. And it is one of the most chilling case studies in recent American history. If you're new here, welcome to Jenny Exposes. I cover the stories that networks buried, the scandals that PR teams tried to spin into oblivion, and the systems that allowed it all to happen. If that sounds like your kind of content, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know, and I promise every single video I make is worth your time. Now, let's get into it. Before we can talk about the collapse, we have to understand the world that made it possible. Covenant Eyes was founded in 2000 by a man named Ron DeHaas, and it was built specifically for Christian men who believed they needed help resisting what the evangelical community broadly called sexual temptation online. The idea was simple. If you know that every website you visit is being logged, screenshotted, and sent to someone who loves you and holds you accountable, you will think twice before going somewhere you shouldn't. The technology evolved over the years. It moved from simple URL tracking to AI-powered image recognition that could blur explicit content before it even fully loaded. It sent weekly reports. It sent instant alerts if someone tried to uninstall the app. It became, in every measurable way, a surveillance system, one that its users embraced wholeheartedly because they have been taught that human nature is fundamentally weak, and that weakness requires watching. Within IBLP-adjacent communities, that's the Institute in Basic Life Principles, a conservative Christian organization that became enormously influential in certain homeschooling and fundamentalist circles. This kind of mutual monitoring was not just acceptable, it was encouraging. Men were taught to confess struggles to their wives and pastors. Women were taught that their role included helping their husbands stay on the right path. And the logic, from the inside, made a strange kind of sense. If you believe that the heart is deceitful above all things, then of course you build systems to catch it lying. The problem, and this is the problem the entire Josh Duggar story is really about, is that systems built to catch deception only work when the person inside the system wants to be caught. Now, Mike Johnson. I want to address him briefly because his name comes up in any serious conversation about Covenant Eyes, and I think it matters. Mike Johnson is the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. He has spoken publicly about using Covenant Eyes with his teenage son, framing it as a parenting choice rooted in his faith. I am not here to mock that. What I am here to do is point out the extraordinary irony that the man who holds one of the most powerful positions in American government, a man who has influence over legislation touching digital privacy, child safety, and free speech online, has chosen to manage his family's internet use through a third-party AI accountability app. I'll let you sit with that. because it tells you something important about the world Josh Duggar was operating in. This was not a fringe belief system. This was mainstream. This was powerful. And if powerful men were using covenant eyes to signal their moral seriousness, then of course a man who needed to perform moral seriousness more than anyone else on earth would use it too. Let's meet Josh Duggar at his peak, not who he became, who he was presented as. The eldest of 19 children born to Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar in Tontitown, Arkansas. A family so large, so photogenic, so committed to their faith that a cable network decided the entire country needed to watch them live. TLC aired 17 Kids and Counting, later 18 Kids and Counting, later 19 Kids and Counting, for nearly a decade. The Duggars became America's most famous family, and Josh, as the eldest son, was positioned as the crown jewel of the whole project. He was proof that the Duggar method worked. By his late 20s, Josh was living in Washington, D.C., serving as the executive director of FRC Action, the lobbying arm of the Family Research Council, an organization classified by some civil rights groups as an anti-LGBTQ hate group. He was lobbying United States Congress members on abortion policy, on marriage legislation, on what he framed as the moral degradation of American culture. He was shaking hands with senators. He was appearing on Fox News. He was the living embodiment of everything the Duggar brand claimed to manufacture. A faithful husband, a devoted father, a righteous man who had been raised right and turned out exactly as advertised. He had covenant eyes on his devices. He had Anna, his wife, who he met through a chaperone courtship process, who he married young, who bore him children, who appeared beside him at every public event looking immaculate and supportive as his accountability partner. He was watched. He was monitored. He was, by every visible metric, exactly who he said he was. And he was lying through every single smile. July 2015. A hacker group called the Impact Team hacked a website called Ashley Madison. If you somehow don't know what Ashley Madison is, it was a dating website with a tagline that was almost offensively on the nose. Life is short, have an affair. The platform existed entirely to connect married people who wanted to cheat on their spouses. The hackers gave Ashley Madison an ultimatum to shut down, or we publish the data of every single user. Ashley Madison did not shut down. And so, in August of 2015, the data dropped. 37 million user accounts, names, email addresses, billing information, physical descriptions, and the personal profiles that people had written describing what kind of partner they were looking for. It was one of the largest and most consequential data breaches in internet history, not because of the technical scale of it, but because of what the data revealed. Journalists and researchers spent weeks combing through it, and somewhere in that ocean of exposed information was the name Josh Duggar. Not one account, two separate accounts. Usernames that included phrases like DC and Josh the Man. Nearly $1,000 spent on the platform. A billing address traced back to his grandmother's home in Arkansas. A personal profile that described in explicit terms exactly the kind of encounter he was looking for. He didn't stumble onto the site. He didn't accidentally end up there. He built a persona. He funded it. He maintained it. He had a strategy. And his wife, Anna, a woman who, thanks to the upbringing she had received, had never lived independently, had never held a formal job, had never had a driver's license, who had been raised to understand that her entire identity and purpose was bound to her husband, found out the same way the rest of the country did. She read it on the internet. Think about that for a moment. The man who had covenant eyes monitoring his every click. The man whose wife was his official accountability partner. The man who lobbied Congress on behalf of family values. That man had been paying for a platform designed specifically to help married people have secret affairs, and his wife found out from a news alert. What happened next is one of the most sophisticated examples of crisis management I have ever seen attempted in real time. And I say that with absolutely no admiration. Josh released a public statement. It was long. It was spiritually framed. It used the language of repentance and brokenness and grace in a way that was almost clinically precise. every word calculated to land on the ears of a specific audience that had been trained to hear confession as evidence of integrity. "I have been the biggest hypocrite ever," he wrote. And in the same breath, he thanked his family for their forgiveness and his wife for her grace. Anna appeared publicly. She stood beside him. She cited her marriage vows. She said she forgave him and they were seeking help. Jim Bob and Michelle released a statement that expressed sadness, while being carefully constructed to avoid any admission that the family machine had produced this outcome. What was notably absent from every single one of these statements? Any serious engagement with what any of this meant. Any acknowledgement that the accountability systems they had publicly championed had failed entirely. Any space for Anna's pain that was not immediately filtered through the question of whether she would stay. The IBLP framework, the same theological structure that had shaped the entire Duggar family's understanding of marriage, gender roles, and wifely duty, taught that if a husband confesses and repents, the wife bears a spiritual obligation to remain, and to remain joyfully. Leaving was not a neutral option. Leaving was not even really framed as an option at all. Anna staying was not stupidity, and I want to be very clear about that. Anna staying was the entirely predictable output of a system that had spent her entire life narrowing the roads available to her until only one remained. But here is what the Ashley Madison story did not tell you. Because at the time, the press treated Josh's affair accounts as the main event. They were not the main event. They were not even close. Before Ashley Madison, before Washington, D.C., before TLC, before any of it, there was something the family had been managing quietly for years. When Josh was 15 years old, he admitted to his parents that he had inappropriately touched several young girls, including members of his own family, his sisters, children. Jim Bob's response was not to contact law enforcement. It was not to pursue professional therapeutic intervention for anyone involved. His response was to send Josh away for several months to work on a home renovation project with a family friend, someone who had no formal counseling credentials, in what was described as a treatment program. The victims received some counseling through the church, no professional psychological care, no legal process. The entire matter was handled internally, quietly, and with the explicit goal of keeping it within the family and away from anything that could damage what the Duggars were in the process of building. A Duggar family friend eventually contacted a state trooper about the situation, a trooper who, it would later emerge, was himself subsequently convicted on separate charges, and nothing formal came of it. The family kept going. TLC kept filming. Josh got married. Josh got a job lobbying Congress. The machine kept running. There were people who knew, families in their community who had been quietly informed. A family named Holt, whose daughter had been in a planned courtship process with Josh, had called it off upon learning what had happened. People knew. They just didn't talk, because within the architecture of this community, protecting the family was the same thing as protecting God's reputation. And so the first time the world got to see any of this was not because the Duggars chose transparency. It was because a magazine called In Touch Weekly filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the police reports. And in May of 2015, 2 months before Ashley Madison, the whole thing went public anyway. The Ashley Madison story did not reveal Josh Duggar's double life. It was the second chapter of a story that had been running quietly for 2 decades. I want to stop here and give you what I think is the analytical key to this entire story, because without it, everything else just reads as salacious gossip. And that is not what this is. Think about the 3 layers of visibility that surrounded Josh Duggar. Covenant Eyes was on his devices, monitoring his digital activity and sending reports to his wife. The IBLP courtship and chaperone structure had monitored his relationships and romantic life since adolescence. He and Anna had never been alone together before their wedding day. And TLC cameras were in his home, filming his family for a national audience for years. He was one of the most watched private citizens in America. He had more surveillance infrastructure around him than most people could imagine. And he was hiding in plain sight. How? Because every single one of those systems had been designed not to discover truth, but to produce an image. Covenant Eyes doesn't detect intent. It detects images on a screen. It cannot tell you what a person wants, what they're planning, what they're doing on devices it isn't installed on, or what they're doing off-screen entirely. The IBLP accountability structure was designed to enforce compliance with a specific behavioral code in visible public settings. It had no mechanism for addressing what happened in private, and it actively discouraged the kind of psychological self-examination that might have surfaced something worth addressing. And TLC cameras? TLC cameras were pointed at the parts of the Duggar household that the Duggars agreed to have filmed, edited by a production company with a financial interest in presenting a particular story. I want you to imagine a fortress made entirely of glass, visible from every angle. You can see every wall, every floor, every ceiling. You can see right through it. And it is completely hollow at the center, because the glass is the structure. There is nothing inside but the performance of what a fortress is supposed to look like. That is what surrounded Josh Duggar. And he knew it. He understood it better than anyone, because he had grown up inside it. In April of 2021, federal agents arrived at a car dealership in Springdale, Arkansas. Josh Duggar had been running the lot for several years. They arrested him on federal charges related to the possession and receipt of content that I'm going to describe as child exploitation material, some of the most serious charges that exist under federal law. The investigation had originated from a tip to Homeland Security. Investigators had traced downloads to an IP address connected to the dealership. And when they dug into the technical specifics of how those downloads had occurred, this is the part that made my jaw drop when I first read it. They found that Josh had installed a separate, hidden, partitioned virtual operating system on the dealership's shared computer. A second operating system, running silently alongside the first, invisible to the primary user interface. A space that existed entirely outside the reach of Covenant eyes, which was installed and running on the visible operating system. He had not just failed the accountability system, he had studied it. He had understood its architecture. He had identified the specific technical gap that it could only monitor what it could see, and that what it could not see was anything running in a separate, hidden partition. And he had built a door in that gap and walked through it. A man whose entire public brand was built on the idea of digital accountability and transparency had become, apparently, technically proficient enough to construct a hidden digital environment specifically to circumvent digital accountability software. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on both counts. In May of 2022, Josh Duggar was sentenced to 12 years and 7 months in federal prison. Anna, at this point the mother of 7 children, attended the sentencing. She's continued to maintain their marriage. I need to take a moment here to talk about what this story actually means, because I think it is possible to watch all of this unfold and come away thinking this is a story about one spectacularly terrible person. It is not, or rather, it is also not only that. Josh Duggar made choices, devastating, criminal choices that hurt real people, including his own family members, including children he had never met who exist now only as evidence files. I am not here to redistribute responsibility. He is responsible. He is in federal prison, and he belongs there. But the system that produced him and protected him for 30 years is also responsible. Covenant Eyes exists because there is an enormous and deeply sincere community of people who believe that human weakness requires external management, and who have turned that belief into a product. The product does not work as advertised, not because the technology is faulty, but because accountability that is performed for an audience is not the same thing as accountability that is lived in private. You can pass every weekly report your spouse ever sees. You can have a perfectly clean Covenant Eyes score for years, and still be running a hidden partition. The IBLP framework that surrounded Josh Duggar, the same framework that taught Anna that her role was to support her husband, that gave her no language for leaving, framed her suffering as a spiritual opportunity. That framework did not accidentally produce this outcome. It produced it by design. Not because anyone intended to create a system that protected predators, but because systems built around the management of appearances will always, inevitably, become tools for people who are skilled at managing appearances. The most dangerous person inside a glass fortress is the one who understands that the glass is what everyone is watching. Mike Johnson is still using Covenant Eyes. He said so on a podcast. He described it as a parenting tool and a personal discipline. I want to be careful here because I genuinely do not know what is on Mike Johnson's devices, and I am not making any accusation about him. What I am saying is this. The man with enormous influence over American legislation about child safety, digital privacy, and internet regulation has publicly framed surveillance software as a solution to the problem of human weakness online. And the most famous case study of that software in action ended with a federal conviction for some of the most serious crimes involving children that exist. That is worth thinking about, not as a partisan point, as a genuine question about what we are actually solving when we install an app instead of doing the harder, slower, less quantifiable work of understanding why the problem exists in the first place. Covenant Eyes cannot tell you why someone wants what they want. It can only tell you what they search for on a monitored device. And if the person using it is motivated primarily by not getting caught, rather than by genuinely changing, they will find the partition. They always find the partition. Here's what I want you to walk away with. Not the gossip. Not the drama, though, yes, this story has more dramatic twists per chapter than most scripted television. I want you to walk away with this question. How many systems in your own life are built to perform accountability rather than create it? Not in the Josh Duggar sense. I mean in the ordinary, everyday sense that most of us live with. The performance reviews at work that everyone plays. The relationship check-ins that stay on the surface because going deeper feels too risky. The social media presence that shows the version of yourself you want people to believe in. The commitments you make loudly in public that quietly dissolve in private. How many glass fortresses are you maintaining? And more importantly, what are they protecting? And for whom? Because the tragedy of the Duggar story is not that the system failed Josh. The system worked. It produced the image it was designed to produce, for years, for a national television audience of millions. While underneath that image, the actual reality of who he was continued to develop unchecked. The tragedy is that the design was always the problem. And the design is still out there, still running, still sending weekly reports to spouses and pastors and accountability partners who believe that seeing the screenshots means they are seeing the truth. Tell me in the comments what you think. Do you think apps like Covenant Eyes actually change behavior, or are they just digital theater for people who have already decided what they want to do? I read every single comment, I reply when I can, and genuinely, this community's perspective on this kind of story is one of my favorite things about running this channel. And if you want to go deeper on the system that made the Duggars possible, the TLC machine, the way a government-funded cable channel became the infrastructure of a specific kind of religious branding, and what happened to the network when the whole thing came apart, that video is already up. The link is in the description. I will see you there.